At the end of today's word, I'm going to leave you with 3 takeaways, but I really want to say to you that I think the power of this word is actually in the story. So I want to invite you, as I go through the story, listen for it for yourself. The 3 takeaways I hope will be helpful, but listen for yourself and let God's Spirit speak to you. So here's the story. Ahab was king of Israel. He was married to a woman called Jezebel, and Jezebel was very anti-God. And when I say God, I mean the God we know. And she was very keen instead on a god called Baal. Jezebel, with the king Ahab's blessing and authority, set about tearing down the altars of God. In other words, destroying the places of worship in Israel. But even worse, she had all the prophets killed as well. This was really a form of religious genocide. Elijah, one of the few prophets who had managed to evade capture and death, was having none of it. And so one day Elijah emerges out of hiding and challenges Ahab and Jezebel to a duel of sorts, I suppose, but not really a duel between them, but really a duel between God and Baal, the false god. And Elijah set up the rules. He said the rules are simple. Each side will set up an altar, put some wood on the altar, and then place a sacrificed bull on top of that. But no one was to bring fire. And then the one who could get their god to light the fire on the altar, they would be the winner, as it were. And so the showdown began. And now, to give the prophets of Baal some credit, they really tried. They danced and chanted all morning until they actually began limping from all the jumping up and down. In the afternoon, they began desperately cutting themselves, trying to invoke some response from their God. And all the while this was going on, Elijah wasn't helpful. He kept mocking them. He said things like, oh, maybe your God's asleep, or perhaps he's just away on holiday, kind of saying, dance harder, cut deeper. And eventually, after most of the day had passed, Elijah blew the whistle and said that now it was his turn. And I think Elijah was in something of a theatrical mood. I think he wanted to kind of rub their noses in it. So Elijah ordered lots and lots of water. And he had them pour water all over his altar, all over the stones, all over the wood, all over the bull. And when enough was poured, he asked for some more. They just poured water. He soaked the place. And then he stood back and he prayed a simple prayer. And the prayer was just, Lord, answer my prayer so that these people will know that you are Lord. And then this massive fire falls from heaven and burns up, consumes everything. But it's what Elijah did next that is nothing short of shocking. He ordered that all 450 of those prophets who had done all the dancing and stuff, those prophets of Baal who were present, he ordered that all of them be rounded up. He took them to a nearby ravine and he killed every one of them. Now remember, this was the man through whom God had done amazing miracles, like raising the dead son of a widow. This is the guy who had managed to evade capture when others had been caught and killed. This was the guy who wasn't afraid to come and confront Ahab and Jezebel, step out of the darkness and come confront them. This was the guy who could kill 450 prophets in the late afternoon after a showdown. I mean, Elijah really was Rambo until the next day, which is when, in fact, our reading for today begins. All Jezebel, the queen, does is send a messenger. That's all. And the message is, what you did to my prophets, I'm going to do to you. And Elijah was, I like to call him, Rambo. And all Elijah does is jump up and flee for his life. He's running scared. And how peculiar. He was brave just a few hours ago. He was brazen just a few hours ago. Something's got into him. Something's got inside his head. Something's got inside his heart, his spirit. Just one sentence from a particular person at a particular time can turn even the strongest person upside down. One sentence from a particular person at a particular time can turn even the strongest person upside down. So what he does is he heads for Beersheba. Beersheba, it's a clever move on his part because it's just outside of Jezebel's political reach. It doesn't mean she can't get him, it's just is harder for her to get him. But he doesn't stop there, he then travels on into the wilderness. He's a fugitive on the run. And while he's in the wilderness, in the desert, he finds a solitary tree and he decides to lie down underneath it. And this time his prayer is so different from the one he prayed just a little while ago. Now he prays, it is enough. It is enough. Now, Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. In other words, I'm as good as dead. It is enough. He's Rambo no more. We're not exactly sure what he is. Is it self-pity? Is it depression? Is he exhausted? Is he despondent? Is he disillusioned? See, I think the problem is, I think the trigger for him was, instead of Jezebel being humiliated, which you would think she would be when her God didn't show up, instead of her being humiliated by the lack of fire and being humiliated by the death of her prophets, instead of being humiliated, she's now emboldened. Emboldened. Evil has prospered. And we know what that's like in our world. We know how that feels. I'm sure you know how it feels. I mean, how long have we had to wait for the state capture crooks to be caught? I'm so grateful that some of them are now being held to account. How long do we have to wait for our ex-president to face justice? He has unleashed all kinds of demons across our nation. And how long must we put up with the politics of fools in our local metro as they play games? While our dams literally dry up and precious drinking water leaks into our streets, these tin gods are playing their idiotic power games in the chamber, much like the prophets of Baal dancing and chanting to an empty sky. We know what it's like when evil prospers, when harm is caused. And so I get why for Elijah, even Elijah, this great prophet of God, I get why he uses that simple phrase, it's enough. It's enough. It's everything that we mentioned earlier. It's depression, it's exhaustion, it's despondency, it's disillusionment. His longing for death is just a way of saying, I'm giving up, I'm done. Now, I'm not sure if this is one last thing before giving up or if this is his giving up, but Elijah decides, after that prayer, decides to go to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. This is an important mountain for the Israelites. This is where God met with and revealed himself to Moses. It's also known as Mount Sinai, by the way. This is where God made covenant with Israel. This is the old Ten Commandments thing. These are Elijah's spiritual roots. If God lives anywhere, he lives here. And so somehow in his despair, in his lostness, in his running away, he heads for home. And he is weary. He is deeply, deeply tired. And so he finds his little tree and falls asleep. And when he sleeps, an angel of the Lord comes and wakes him up and encourages him to eat some of the food and water that the angel himself has provided for him. It's a beautiful way of saying God is with him. God is near to him, attentive to him. But his tiredness is overwhelming, so he falls back asleep. And the angel returns again and again, another exquisite picture. Hasn't left him just once. He comes back again and offers him more food and drink. And this time the angel says that the journey is long, and so he gives him food, which now sounds a lot like our communion service, gives him food which sustains him for this long journey, for 40 days and 40 nights. Then he eventually arrives at Horeb, and the Lord speaks to him. And when the Lord speaks to him, it's not advice, it's not encouragement, it's not an inspirational, hope-filled word, it's not a rah-rah, it's just a question. And it doesn't feel like a very welcoming question, because the question is, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? But questions are, in a moment like this, questions are deeply respectful. Because not even God presumes to know what brought Elijah to this place. God is giving space for Elijah to speak, for Elijah to be heard, for this to be Elijah's story. Elijah in this moment needs nothing else, no rah-rah, no word of advice. And so Elijah says, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. In other words, I've done my best, I've given my all. And the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with a sword. And that's not entirely true, because it was actually Jezebel that did it. It wasn't the general population. But Elijah is saying, I feel like everyone's against me. And then he says, and I alone am left. And that too is not entirely true, because we know that there were some other prophets in Israel at the time, but he feels alone. And he says, and these people are seeking my life and they want to take it away. He's not happy. And then God says to him, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by, which is a lot like what happened to Moses. Now there was a great wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Elijah, perhaps more than most, knows well the God of fire and earthquake. That was how he moved. But this time, God comes to him in the sound of sheer silence. And then what makes this passage so interesting is that the question remains exactly the same. Despite all the wind and the earthquake and the fire, the question remains the same. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah's response is identical. Not one word changes. It's identical to the one he gave before. Nothing has shifted for Elijah. He's had no great insight through the earthquake, wind and fire, and the still small voice. There's no great insight, no change of heart, no big miracle has happened to him. Because as we know that sometimes in life there are no quick fixes, there are no easy answers. Life doesn't work like that. Sometimes we need something else other than quick fixes and easy answers. And our story leaves us with just 3 gifts that may be helpful for us today. The first is the gift of angels. The angel in our story is really much of the affirmation that we read in that famous Psalm 121, where God promises, he who watches over you will never slumber nor sleep. The promise of the angel is that even as Elijah is in his troubles, that God watches over him and God never slumbers nor sleeps. Now, I'm always cautious with affirmations like this, because I know that when we are really in trouble, I think of moments when I've felt really in trouble, a promise like this can feel empty, which is why I like in our story that the angel feeds Elijah and gives him something to drink. It's practical, it's tangible, it's sacramental. And I think that God often reminds us of this truth, that he watches over us, that he is near, through the practical kindness and care of others. So can I say to you today, when you feel like you've had enough, like Elijah, when you've had enough, keep your heart and your eyes open for angels. Some will be in the spirit, some will be in your heart, but some might come to you practically and in person. The second gift I think that our story gives us today is the gift of silence. As we've seen in our story, God is sometimes in the spectacular, but he is always in the silence. Elijah didn't need advice in this moment. He didn't need someone to build him up or encourage him. What he really needed is he needed to be heard. The great thinker Thomas Merton said, the speech of God is silence. The speech of God is silence. And so when we feel like we've had enough, when heaven seems silent, it may well be that that is when God is speaking to us, and that God is not only speaking to us, but God might be listening most deeply to us when heaven feels silent. So if you've had enough, can I really deeply encourage you to schedule some moments for deliberate solitude and silence in your life? Really. I don't mean just sitting alone in a room. I mean, be intentional about it, but set it aside. I really think my own experience, my own witness to it, is that it can keep you alive. And the third and final gift that I think our passage gives us today is the gift of lament. I think the reason that God doesn't offer any quick fixes here is because Elijah needs to grieve. Things haven't gone as Elijah wanted them to. Life feels unjust for Elijah. And God knows that Elijah is going to be stuck here if he doesn't have a chance to speak the truth, if he doesn't have a chance to mourn, if he doesn't have a chance to cry out. And I think in the Christian community, we are big on praise, but we are low on lament. We have learnt well how to sing our songs of praise, but we've struggled. We've not learnt well how to lament. We struggle to speak truthfully to God, to tell him the whole truth of our lives. And if this is helpful for any, can I say that I found speaking my laments to another person to be the most helpful way to keep lament as a part of my devotion. I really want to encourage you as a follower of Jesus to be attentive to the laments of your heart. I think it keeps us more deeply open to the life of God. So Elijah went on to prophesy that Jezebel would die and that her body would be eaten by dogs. He's a fun guy, this guy. And she did, and she was eaten by dogs. And then in a wonderful twist, Elijah is one of the few people in the Bible who actually never died. He got caught up in a chariot of fire and was taken straight up to heaven. Now, how's that for a story?